Hi, good morning and good evening to everyone. We will be starting the webinar here shortly. Hi, welcome to today's webinar, the fully automated insurance pricing process. I'm your host, Bob Eichelberger from Ernix, and I will be moderating today's webinar. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Attendees will be silenced throughout the presentation. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for questions. To ask a question, please use the question tab on the right-hand side of your screen. If you run into any technical issues along the way, please send an email to us at victorvlad@ernix.com. So with that, welcome to our second webinar in our Thought Leadership webinar series targeting the insurance industry ecosystem, the fully automated insurance pricing process. Following today's webinar, you will receive a recording of this session and an invitation to our next event on April 20th. Today, we are fortunate to have Drew Lorio join us. Drew is the head of professional services for the Americas at Ernix, working with insurance providers both domestically and abroad. Drew has a variety of experience in the fields of pricing and rating, risk modeling, and pricing process and efficiencies. Prior to joining Ernix, Drew worked at Country Financial, where he held a variety of positions in the actuarial department. His work primarily focused around predictive modeling, competitive analysis, and experimental design. Drew holds an MS in statistics from Illinois State University. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Drew.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. Thanks for everybody joining today. So this is actually the second time that we're doing this webinar. We did this specifically for the U.S. market a few weeks ago, and had a lot of really positive feedback and a lot of interest from the more international audience. So we're excited to be doing this for you today. So the topic's the fully automated pricing process, and it's this is something I've actually been passionate about for a long time, just automation and the future of the workforce. And it seems very timely right now, considering all of our jobs are kind of changing and evolving. One of the things I used to do was present at my daughter's junior high career fair. And so I had a booth set up, and I actually used a handy tool that I found one time that says, what's the risk of your job being automated over the next 20 years? And so, these kids would come up to the booth and they would say, when I grow up, I want to be a firefighter. So I would plug things in. So I'm here in central Illinois, which is just smack dab in the middle of the United States. There's really nothing here but corn and beans. So the thing I would hear from a lot of these children was, I want to be a farmer when I grow up. So I would enter that into my engine and I would say, okay, 76%. In the future, farming is going to be automated about 76%. So, maybe it's a good career path. Maybe you might want to consider something else. Another one I heard a lot was engineer. A lot of kids interested in being engineers. Only 3% chance of automation. It's a fairly technical job, requires a lot of creativity. It's just a human process. Something I heard quite a few times from kids where, I want to be an accountant like my dad. Well, accountants are really just a series of complex rules. Anybody who's used TurboTax for the US-based clients, I assume there's other international tools. It's getting a lot simpler than it used to be. So this is something that's going to be automated. What about actuaries? What about pricing professionals? I'm going to keep you in suspense and let you know this at the end of the webinar. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the insurance industry right now. It's historically hasn't been the most interesting industry, but looking across what companies are doing these days. We have straight through underwriting using intelligent machines, chatbots working in customer service, like really fun stuff happening with image-based claim settlements. What about pricing? What's next for us? What's going to be our transformative breakthrough? So what we're going to go through today is, the vision of this fully automated process. Next, we're going to talk about some of the technology that we need in order to enable the automation. Then we're going to go through the process as I envision it, kind of then versus now. Talk through some of the roles and responsibilities, who's ultimately accountable for facilitating this, and then go into the challenges and opportunities that are presented with a fully automated process. So automation, let's just start off by saying, what is automation? What are the benefits to it? So in the past, the main reason companies were going after automation was a way to control costs. Let's figure out how to save as much money as possible. Truthfully, though, that's why we're going after it in the past. It's not necessarily why we're going to go after it in the future. In the future, I think automation offers a ton of additional benefits that are well past just kind of basic cost reduction. One of the things that we're seeing right now through automation is reduction in rating errors. Most errors actually come from the handoff process when you create your rates and then within the pricing department and then try to hand them off to IT. That handoff process is where majority of the errors are actually taking place. So if we can automate that handoff, immediately we're going to see a huge reduction in errors. Compliance and governance. So when you have human processes, these are much harder to govern. When you have automated processes, there's built-in audit trails. It just becomes a much easier thing to govern, and fewer mistakes are happening along the way. Reducing the manual processes. So this one comes back to there are cost-saving benefits. If we can get people from physically typing numbers into spreadsheets into automatically pre-populating things, there's great benefits there. Creating transparency and auditability. So when you have this fully automated process, you can actually look at the code. You can look at what this does, as opposed to trying to sit with somebody and say, okay, so what do you do day to day? Because you might get the full story, you might not. But automation gives us the ability to actually measure and monitor things in a more responsible way. And then the final thing is speed to market, increased process execution speed and agility. Recently, we did a roundtable with a few insurance executives in our Boston office, and the number one thing that we were hearing loud and clear that people suffer from is agility and speed to market. That's the main thing people feel that they're missing in their pricing process today. So obviously, automation is a way to speed things up. So why do we care about automation? Truthfully, in most of my career, I've been trying to figure out how to do better math. I was researching machine learning long before it was a kind of a mainstream topic. I was always trying to figure out the best algorithm and the way to squeeze out a little bit more predictive power. And so as an industry overall, what we're seeing is we've come a long way in terms of the analytic sophistication. However, there's diminishing returns, right? So we can keep investing more and more and more in analytics and trying to do better math, but eventually you get to a point where the effort just doesn't equate to the value. So we need to start improving along a different dimension. And so, in my opinion, it's much more impactful. I think it's going to be a source of competitive advantage the more automated you are, so that you can get these good analytics in the market much faster than you have before. So I think we're going to be increasing along this process sophistication dimension, and it's really going to be kind of the future of the competitive landscape. So what does this process look like? What is a fully automated pricing process? This is a little abstract, so let me just tell you what my personal vision is. This is kind of my dream for the industry. I want to walk into the office and push a big button that just says automate. And what that does is it takes all my data, it reads in the data, refits my models, re-optimizes everything, goes straight to rate deployment, does my rate auditing, does any of my regulatory filings, automatically tunes and monitors itself, all with a click of a button. So it's definitely a crazy futuristic view, but I think it's something that we can get to maybe over the next 50 years. But it's all about taking this thing a piece at a time. So first thing we have to understand is the technology. Like, what are the actual tools that are going to enable all of this? So there's a handful of different tools out there. So one of the classics that I see lots of companies using and people are generally comfortable with it is VBA. So using Visual Basic for primarily Excel. Honestly, I think this is relevant when you have a lot of Excel table manipulation that needs to be done. However, I would say from what I've observed, maybe 80% of work done in VBA should probably be done in a different tool. So it's very relevant, very practical where it's appropriate, except it's not a one tool fits all. SAS. SAS is a fantastic, robust tool. The reality, though, is it's getting a little dated. So it's really good at performing complex data transformations. So I'm a big fan of using SAS to do some of my data heavy lifting. So if I need to merge, do complex joins on exposure data and claim data, and repeat this process every year, I think SAS is a fine tool to automate that type of thing. Downside, though, is comes with a premium. Python or any of these open source tools, and I would say especially Python, I think is just a fantastic tool. What I'm able to see people do with this is amazing. At the end of the day, it is open source. And so it does have a certain lack of governance. And so as long as you have good business processes around how to kind of monitor, maintain, and manage your Python scripts, I think it can be a great tool to help automate things. Okay, RPA. Now we're kind of getting in more into these modern automation tools. So RPA refers to robotic process automation. I've worked with a handful of companies that have had different RPA initiatives. The thing that I was always a little bit shocked about is whenever I would propose an idea and say, you know what, this would be a great thing to use RPA for, everybody would look at me and say, well, that's a little bit too complex. Really, all RPA is good for is just automatically clicking buttons, which is good. I wish we could always do a little bit more with it, but it's a good start. What I find it's the best for is with legacy technology, being able to kind of automate those processes, and so you can kind of click through legacy technology tools. The next iteration of this technology is going to be IPA, which is intelligent process automation. So it kind of uses the basics of RPA, but also overlays certain principles of machine learning, natural language processing, things like that. And so it's kind of taking it to the next level. I think there's a lot of hype around this, unclear exactly where this technology is going to fit and how transformative it's going to be. Automated machine learning. I would say the leader in auto ML right now is DataRobot and H2O. They have some fantastic tools that really, it's automates the statistical modeling process. There's pros and cons to this, and we'll get into it a little bit deeper later in the presentation. Finally, natural language processing. It's really the technology that allows us to move between language and code. So there's a lot of applications for this, but truthfully, I think there was a lot of hype and it's starting to lose momentum. So the main takeaway here, there's no one tool that is going to do all of this for you. It's really about having a complete, robust tool set that you can leverage and use the right tool for the right job. So I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but this is the classic hype cycle. So when new technologies come out, they gain popularity and these things shoot up to the top and everybody's talking about it. I'm sure everybody remembers a few years ago when everyone talked about big data. Well, you know what? Nobody talks about big data anymore. It's just data, and sometimes you have more of it, sometimes you have less of it, but it's not going to be this transformative technology. Whereas something like Hadoop, yeah, that's a legitimate technology used to process big data. We're seeing this on the automation side too. So tools like AutoML right now are at the peak. So this is going to tail off, but there's still going to be a practical future for AutoML. Some of the things we see sliding down the curve right now are robotic process automation. I think this is getting to a reasonable level of maturity and people are figuring out the right ways to use it. Same thing with natural language processing. Intelligent process automation, IPA, is still kind of on the climb. But I think this one is, it's going to follow the same process as classic RPA. So the process itself, one of the things that I tell everyone is that you have to love your pricing process before you automate it. In my prior employer, I was running our R&D functions, and I would see people doing different steps of the pricing process and automating these, and I would just look at it and say, like, this is a very elegant solution, but why do we even do this? So before you start automating, make sure you really love the process. So one of the things that I actually assisted with at my prior company was mapping out the entire end-to-end pricing process from kickoff meeting and data collection all the way through post-deployment. And what I found out is it's ugly. Like it is a messy, complex process. And then as I rejoined Ernix, I was, start meeting with lots of other companies, and everyone has the same issue. I have not met a company who is absolutely in love with their pricing process. And so it seems like something systemic that just needs to be fixed. One of the classic tools that we throw at business process like these are Six Sigma. And you know what? It's a great methodology. I think it has its place. But usually what happens when we try to do basic process improvement here is we chop off a couple days here, a couple days there, and we call it a win. In most cases, for most companies, I think there's a complete rebuild of the pricing process that needs to happen from the ground up. So here's my pricing process, and this is obviously overly simplified. Obviously, the pricing process is going to vary based on your regulatory market. So honestly, what I'm presenting here is slightly different than what I would present to the U.S. market. But in general, it kind of follows the same structure. We start with the data management. We move into the modeling. From there, we define the pricing strategy. We blend all our models together. At that point, we're going to do some testing to understand what's going to happen in the market. And then we move to deployment. And then finally, we have monitoring. There's a fun little feature in here too that is our automatic tuning. So once we have things deployed, actually letting the machine adjust our prices for us. And then depending on what your local regulatory requirements are, there might be different reporting requirements. So we're actually going to dig into each of these steps a little bit deeper, talk about the steps in the process, the tools required to facilitate that process, and who's the right person in your organization to actually work through that. But before we get to that, we have a couple of polling questions. So if you can navigate to the polling section of the tool, first question I have is, how would you classify the pricing process at your company? Would you say that you're best in class, you have everything you want? Would you say, it's good process, but we could probably modernize a few parts? Would you categorize it as a very manual process where you're just constantly rebuilding rates, doing handoffs? Or would you say this is something that we just need to rebuild from the ground up? So if you can give you guys a few moments to respond to the polling questions, and you can find those in the poll tab. Okay. So looks like majority, about 50%, are saying that they have a very manual process that needs to be rebuilt multiple times. It's similar to what we were hearing in the US market. Shockingly, not too many people think that it needs to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. So that's good to hear. Um, no one is saying that they have a best-in-class process. So let's jump to the next question. Over the next 5 years, what percent of the current pricing process do you think can be automated? So personally, my dream is 100%, but I'm pretty practical, and over the next 5 years, I don't think it'll be quite that high. It does seem like the attendees here do have a pretty ideal vision for the future, where about a third of respondents think that we might be able to get this over 50% automated in the next 5 years. And so I would actually agree with that assessment. I think when we really break down the process and simplify it and lean it out, when we look at the core of what it is to do a pricing process, things are actually pretty simple. And if we simplify this thing, I think we can actually get a lot of it automated. Okay, final question. What do you think is your number one challenge in the pricing process? Is it that it's just prone to errors? You know, you spend all this time trying to track down and correct errors. Slow speed to market. So you have these great ideas, but your IT team tells you that it's going to, you know, take them 3 years before they can actually implement that. Technology restrictions, actually deploying the models. So, you know, maybe you have the latest and greatest gradient boosted model, and your IT folks just kind of look at you confused because they have no idea how to implement that. Or is it too many stakeholders in the process? You know, so one thing that I've seen before is that you just have, you know, your actuaries, your product management team, your marketing, your field sales. All of these people are trying to provide input into the process, and it just slows things down. So here, very similar to what we've kind of heard across our other global markets, slow speed to market seems to be the number one issue that customers are facing. And, you know, this is even more relevant in today's market. All those predictive models that we spent all those years developing today are not that relevant. But what is relevant is people need to adapt quickly. So I think we're feeling this squeeze even more than we had just a few months ago. So um, thank you all for providing the input. That was it for these polling questions. One thing to be on the lookout for is Ernix is going to be doing a more complete uh, industry survey around polling, just so that we can make sure that you guys have the latest and greatest information about the industry. So let's break this process down a little bit. I'm gonna try to get through these steps reasonably quickly, but I just want to highlight a few key things on each of them. So first one is data management. So we spend most of our time as practitioners, we spend most of our time working with data, day in and day out. I would say one thing that happens a lot is you have your IT data, you know, your kind of your core operating data that's usually kind of ugly, kind of messy, and then it goes through multiple layers to get updated, to become a rich data set that you can actually do statistical modeling on. Well, the problem is when it goes through all those layers, now to get it back into production, you have to essentially reverse all those layers again. One of the things that I would say the most successful companies are doing is they're bringing their production data much more closely aligned with their analytics data. And so I would say one of the keys to doing this is doing analytics data on structured data sets. So for the auto industry, one of the, I would say the main structure of data that I'm starting to see companies converge on is kind of this 5-tiered structure where there is policy level information. Below policy, there might be multiple vehicles. Sometimes it's just, depending on your market, it's just one policy per vehicle. Below vehicles, there's a list of coverages. Then we have all of our driver level information. Below the driver, there's claims. And so this typical 5-table structure is what we're seeing. Anything that we can do to actually leverage this more directly with analytics, I think is going to help us start reducing the time that it takes to put analytics in the market. One other important thing to call out is really the standardization across all data sets. So if you have the same variable names, the same variable levels, and it crosses both your production, new business data, renewal data, recent cancellations, if everything is reasonably well unified and there's a high level of data governance, that obviously just pays for itself. That type of investment to standardize data pays for itself multiple times over. Internal data versus external data. So clearly there's a lot of great external data out there. And one of the things that's kind of interesting when we talk about automations, for a lot of companies, it's actually easier to automate external data feeds than it is to automate internal data feeds. So that's just one of those things. Don't be scared of external data, because sometimes it's actually, in the long run, cheaper to work with an external data provider than try to clean up your own internal data. Ideally, you'll have a blend of both of these, but figure out how you can automate things using better external data feeds. One of the things that we do here in the US is have automated pre-fills, so where we're able to actually pre-populate a lot of information based on third-party data providers. So a few things to call out. Obviously there's a lot of actions to automate in the data management stage. I would say this is the place where we have spent the most time automating. We, as in the industry in general. So, we've already done have a lot of good data scripts, have a lot of good things that do data cleansing. There's a variety of technologies being leveraged, Python, SAS, SQL, VBA. So a lot of great tools out there. If you're hiring somebody specifically for this, data engineers, if you don't have any data engineers, look up the skill set, because it is very, very relevant. So, and truthfully, this thing is going to be one of the most important steps in automating your end-to-end process. Once you get the data done, the rest of it kind of starts to get a little bit easier. I would also highly encourage strong partnerships and connectivity between the IT teams and the actuarial teams. The more that you actually interact with these folks, the better off you're going to be. One of the things that my prior team did that was actually really successful is, just take these folks out to lunch. I know it's a little bit harder in today's, the global situation, but when things change, like, take these folks out to lunch, because that just building personal relationships is going to take you a long way. So, statistical modeling. So one of the, I would say, most fun steps in all of this. So there's a whole variety of models that we can automate. So our demand models, retention, midterm cancellation, new business. Each model kind of has its own time frame that we can refresh these along. So something like retention might need a semi-annual update. New business conversion is a little more dynamic, could use quarterly or even monthly updates. Loss cost modeling, usually goes through a pretty standard update process. One thing to not be afraid of is machine learning. I think people have a very realistic view of what this technology and methodology can and can't do. So from what I've seen, gradient boosted machines are just about the best thing out there to model loss cost. If you can use those in production, awesome. If you can't, it's still valuable to probably build out some of these models so you can have a true estimate of what is your expected underlying cost to your customers. And honestly, these are just going to be table stakes in the future, in my opinion. So again, there's a lot of steps that go into the automating the model development, refitting the data, identifying new data elements, transformations, model comparison. In terms of the technology, there's specific auto ML tools out there like DataRobot. H2O has some good packages. So there's different things that you have access to. In terms of the required skill sets, we have our classic data scientists, predictive modelers, statisticians. One of the things I advise folks to do is manually create models first, because this is one of those places where things can potentially go wrong. You need to have a decent level of comfort, and you need to know what you're looking at. So if you just let somebody blindly build models, you might be surprised by the results. So make sure that you at least have a basic level of comfort and familiarity before you start fully automating this step of the process. Pricing strategy. This is, in my opinion, the most fun part of the entire process. This is also potentially the only stage, if you had this end-to-end process fully automated, this is potentially the only stage where you need to have some type of human input, because this is where you say, we're trying to grow our business, or we're trying to maximize profits, or we're trying to diversify our portfolio. This is where you actually define your business goals. The rest of the process is going to be orchestrated around. So obviously the core of this is optimization. So understanding, having robust measurement around where we're at today, and then being able to actually test out the scenarios of, if we change rates, if we put in a new pricing strategy, where are we going to be? And then even taking that out to the final step, which is saying, okay, here are our business constraints. What's the optimal way to define our pricing strategy? And so we can obviously get really deep into optimization, but I'll kind of set that one aside for right now and just say it's the core of the pricing strategy in many ways, because the optimization in and of itself has all of these business assumptions fully embedded. So really here what we're doing is combining our statistical models. So this is the step where we're able to take our loss cost and our customer demand and our discount models and all these different things, and maybe even these multi-term or multi-year views, combine all this information together so that we can forecast these things out and ultimately define what we want to optimize. This is also the step where I would say there's a certain level of kind of technical skills that are required to actually set this up. But usually between the rate testing and the actual modeling stage, most of the technology gets covered. Main thing that you want in here is somebody with strong business domain expertise to guide this. So this is really where we want the pricing professionals, the actuaries, product managers, to be able to provide input on this process and what they want the target outcome to be. One of the things that I really recommend is that companies have very robust KPI projections that come out of these different strategies, and make sure that you're actively managing to these projections. So anytime that we put a new pricing strategy in the market, we're going to have a list of metrics that say, here's my expected growth, here's my expected retention, here's my expected profitability, and then we actively monitor these things so that we know when we're getting out of bounds. Ultimately, that kind of takes us to the end step, which is the monitoring, but it really needs to be defined upfront in the pricing stage. So after we've defined our pricing, we kind of move on to the testing stage. The thing with testing is it's not very sexy. It's not very fun or exciting, but it's just very practical and something that needs to happen. What I can say is that I see a lot of companies with very heavy manual testing processes. Sometimes they create tons and tons of redundant work that add very minimal amounts of value. So of all the areas that I think can be completely be reinvented, I think rate testing is one of those areas that could be just fully rebuilt from the ground up. So the technology to actually build out testing. So I think there's some good Python scripts that can be written. I also think this is a place where we can use RPA and IPA, so that when we have, if we have a column of premiums that we already know are accurate and we're auditing those against some type of new premium, be able to actually flag what's different. So I would say this is actually one of the more difficult aspects of the automation process, is being able to identify where there are these anomalies, but not even so much to flag where there are these anomalies, but what do you do about it? So there's a whole process where you actually need to notify the stakeholders, and so that's where IPA comes in, because if we have a correctly defined intelligent process automation, we can start to figure out how to correct these on our own. So, for example, maybe the wrong table got uploaded. If we detect that it was the wrong table, an intelligence system is able to go out, find the right table, re-upload that, and kind of continue with the process. So it definitely kind of gets into the evolution of what this could look like in the future. One other important thing that I do want to call out is the data that's used for testing. So again, that should definitely be standardized across all your different data sets, but I would say best-in-class companies are using 3 pieces of data to do their testing. So obviously they're using their in-force book of business, where you run all of your current policies through the system. They're using a sample of new business quotes, so you're looking at the type of business that you're quoting. You want to make sure that even if you're not writing these customers, you're still returning premiums where you want to be returning premiums. And then the third set is actually a synthetic example. So maybe it's a batch of use cases, of 100 or 1,000 that you run through the system. Some of them have intentionally missing values. Some of them you want to fail. Some of them you want to have set the default values. But you're constantly kind of running this synthetic set through. This is actually something that IT is pretty familiar with, this type of process, and so they are good partners to kind of help define exactly what these synthetic test cases should look like. Deployment. So thinking back to early in this presentation, deployment was one of the areas where I think there's great opportunity for improvement. It's also where most of the things go wrong. So when we move from having to find pricing strategy to putting that pricing strategy in the market, that handoff is where a lot of things are broken. So when we do deployment, we have to do things like perform system checks, do different user requests and permissions, actually, and then ultimately implement the rates into the rating engine. So Python, there's specialized tools that can actually facilitate this. It's usually a marriage between the IT team and actuarial team. So this is a bottleneck. It's a great bottleneck for most of the companies. I would say what the best companies are doing is they're actually shifting the responsibility from IT over to the business. I think something that we actually see is we're insurance professionals. We're really good at building and selling and managing insurance products. However, we have just as many IT people in the company as we do, core business people. So anything that we can do to kind of minimize that knowledge gap, or kind of put more IT accountability into the hands of the business, actually gets amazing results by shortening that knowledge window and that handoff. So last point to make on the rate deployment of all the areas in the pricing process, this one is mission critical. I mean, this is the one where your rates are going out into the market. This is the one where you can't have mistakes. And so it does require a high level of governance and control within the stage of the project to ensure that things aren't getting broken. So, even though I say things like you could program this in Python, I would not recommend, just having one of your really talented developers spend a weekend building you a new rating engine, because I don't think that is going to, even though it could be brilliant and it could technically work, I don't think it's the right, correct, robust, long-term solution that most major companies need. Monitoring. I would say monitoring is one of the least interesting parts of the process. It's also one of the most underserved, but it's also one of the most critical. So a lot of times we spend time thinking about the next thing to implement. So we're always working on the next project, the next, the next rate change, the next optimization algorithm, and not really paying attention to the results from the past. This is kind of just the call to action to say, okay, you know what? And making sure that monitoring is simple and seamless, and then it puts the right information into the right people's hands at the right time. That's the key piece of monitoring. Also, it's I would kind of say this is part of it where we're able to do A/B testing within the market. So we're able to continuously measure how champion challenger models work, because a lot of times I actually see people doing champion challenger models, and every time they go to analyze those results, they sit down and it becomes a week or 2 week or sometimes 1 month process where they try to explain what's actually happening. Most of that is things that can be automated, so that the monitoring is constantly pumping out the results of A/B testing. So the step that I'm most excited about, honestly, is price tuning. Um, so what price tuning refers to is the idea that if we have everything intelligently defined, we can actually have rates updating themselves, which is a little scary, a little bit abstract, but incredibly exciting when you think about the potential. Because the market's always changing, right? Especially these days, it's kind of unpredictable. But there's going to be changes in competition, market strategy, mix of business, and processes. So things are changing that are outside of your control. This last one, I think of when marketing changes everything that they're doing, you're forced to react to it, and a lot of times you're not taking that into account in your models. And so we need something that's a little bit more dynamic that can react to it. So this is a pretty classic thing that we see where you have a conversion rate you've modeled out, predictive models are working well, everything's humming along, and then all of a sudden things drop, the actual rates drop, and it has really nothing to do with what you've done in your job. It just happens to be what happened within the market. So how do we react to this? So typically we have to measure it, we have to monitor it, we have to then have a pricing committee meeting, we have to jump through all these hoops. The practical reality is there are ways to define technology where you can set up an iterative system that's constantly monitoring this and say, okay, I see that the rates have just, or the conversion has just dropped. Let's go ahead and re-optimize, refit our Lambda, and try to pull this rate back up while we're still maybe sacrificing a little bit of profitability, but it gets our growth rate back up to where we need it to be. So this is exciting and promising technology. It's a little scary. I mean, we're definitely releasing some control, but I can tell you this is something that we're actually currently seeing in the market right now. Is the ability to actually auto adjust the optimal rates that are actually out there in the market. So I would say price tuning is kind of a combination of many smaller automated processes. So this is kind of what it culminates to, and it's essentially a self-contained process itself. So it's a combination of having very strong industry knowledge. So you need your actuaries, you need some data scientists, somebody who are like really understand the statistical models behind the scenes, also what it means to kind of refit your lambdas on the fly. I would say the key to success here is governance, being able to control the system and being very transparent with your stakeholders. So people need to feel comfortable with this because it is releasing some control. I would recommend starting off with pretty tight constraints because this is something that has, it will adjust the rates that customers see. And anytime you do that, you need to make sure you have the right series of checks and balances in place so that you're just not changing the market price at random, but you really know and you can predict what the system is going to do and how it's actually going to behave over time. Final step, and then I'll get off this whole part of the presentation, is reporting. It's just a basic job function. I think that most people are pretty familiar with the reporting step and processes. It's just, it's something that we can automate via a variety of different tools. So whether it's natural language processing, VBA, RPA, intelligent process automation. It's kind of it's just something that we have to do. Okay, enough of that stuff. So let's move into the implementation. Roles and responsibilities. So who's ultimately accountable for automation? Because it's not just one person. You don't have the automation person. Um, First off, it takes a good level of management support. So you need top-down management. You need good process owners. So I would say this is one of the number one things that companies are lacking is end-to-end oversight of this process because it crosses so many silos. But very few companies have one person who kind of owns this process, and it can't be your chief actuary. You need somebody who's much deeper into the details, who can kind of manage and govern this process. Product manager, project managers. So, I think project managers are an underutilized resource within actuarial departments and data science departments. First time I started working with project managers, I didn't fully understand what they did. Now they're my best friends. So they're the people that take care of all the logistics and kind of get things done so that I can focus on data science and analytics. And then obviously you need your technical experts, you need your business experts, your data experts, your technology experts. One of the things I tell people all the time is ideally you're going to have more people doing the work than managing the work. Something that I see happen a lot is you just get stuck in these meetings after meetings after meetings. And so you have, 10 hours worth of meetings for every 1 hour of work that actually gets done. So it's something you just can't fall into that trap. So navigating the challenges, I mean, there's tons of reasons that people are moving slow on this. What if things go wrong? It's going to take a lifetime to get through all of this. Like just basic change management. Like, you're crazy to think that we could actually automate all this stuff. There's a lot of reasons not to do this. The way I view this is when there are boulders in our way, we can either chip away at them or we can move around them or blow them up. I think a lot of times when we do, I used to lecture my teams about this all the time. When you do your performance review, does your performance review at the end of the year say, there's this big boulder and I chipped away at it this much and next year I'm going to keep chipping away at it? Or did you figure out some way to actually transform? Did you figure out a way to get around this boulder or just completely blow it up? Because that's what modern businesses need. It's, time is too valuable right now to waste it just chipping away little by little at these major challenges. So key takeaways that I'd like you to leave with. So obviously, number one, and I think I probably hit on this even more than I did automation, is you got to love your pricing process. I mean, you really have to be comfortable with it, and it has to be something you want to automate. If you don't love the process, take the time to love it before you take the time to automate it. Break it down into bite-sized chunks. You're not going to automate this entire thing overnight. It's really going to be a series of small automated tasks that ultimately roll up. And those small tasks are going to roll up to larger tasks, are going to roll up to larger tasks. Use a variety of tools. There's not going to be one tool that does everything you need it to do. So just have a variety of tools at your disposal. Don't underestimate the importance of change management. So anytime that any department goes through some type of automation initiative, there's change management that needs to go along with it. This is something that we don't spend enough time talking about. But if you just go and try to force automation on people, they're not always going to buy into that vision immediately. Find somebody who's going to own the end-to-end pricing process. It kind of goes along with that first point. You need somebody who has ownership who can actually be able to see this thing from A to Z. Because when you're trying to just manage a chunk of a process at a time, it gets very clunky, very disjointed, and those handoffs are just a lot less effective. So, and then most importantly, this is all a journey. We're not going to get there overnight. We're going to take this thing at bite-sized pieces, but I would say one of the most important things for me is every meeting that you have internally that has anything to do with process, the word automation should be used. It should just be part of your basic vocabulary. We need to find ways to automate things, to make things more seamless, more integrated, because it's going to be a the future frontier of competitive advantage. Okay, so as I promised you, what about actuaries? When we plug actuary into this engine, what do we get out? What's the potential for automating us out of jobs? 21%. So you know what? At the end of the day, what we do is very specialized. It really is. There's special hands-on knowledge, and so it's fun to talk about this fully automated process. In reality, we're going to be working on this thing for a long time, and there's going to be a lot of work for us to do for many, many years. So with that, I think we're a little bit over on time, but figured we would open the floor up to see if there are a few questions.
Yeah, Drew, there's a few that came in. So we'll start with, should companies centralize all their automation initiatives to achieve greater scale across their companies?
Good question, Bob. So, this is one of the things that I do hear a lot is there are these kind of centralized automation units within companies. Should we stick, all of our automations in this one area? To that, I would say no. I actually think a more decentralized model works better because any business process has so much specialized knowledge that's needed that it's easier, in my opinion, to teach people automation technology and methodology than it is to teach them about the insurance pricing process or the underwriting process or the claims process. So let those people kind of house their knowledge and bring the skill sets to them.
Great. Another one, do you feel these processes can be compatible with life and non-life products?
Awesome question. So it's one of the other things I've presented on a few times is the multi-product optimization. So like, what do these really look like when we start bringing all these different products together? So first off, in and of itself, I actually think there's more opportunity on the life side of the house to automate their internal processes. I think they're a little further behind, like analytically and processy. There's a lot more paper that exists in the life side, so there's a lot more opportunity. Actually bringing these things together, I think bringing together your property casualty and your life health sides of the house so that you have a more holistic view of your customer has huge business benefits. Number one challenge is your own internal data. So until you have a robust data strategy, I wouldn't pursue that too far and just focus within a single line of business until you know how you can actually start blending these data sources together.
Great. And then another one just came in. What about fully automating the motor fleet or big corporate client underwriting process?
Good question. So there's, I think your large commercial accounts always pose like a different set of challenges. And the underwriting process is fundamentally different. It's a much more human process. So it's something that is definitely more challenging and has more unique opportunities. But again, I think the first step is to actually look across the entire portfolio and say, what are the things that all of our accounts have the same. What are the steps of the process? Even though that each account gets handled individually and differently, you're always going to be able to find some common threads. So I would say start with the common threads and build from there.
Great. So, well, thank you for everyone for attending today and joining Drew and our panel. For more information on what Ernix does for pricing and rating, please visit the Ernix website. Please stay tuned and join Ernix for our next webinar in this series. Our next webinar will be on April 20th, and we'll focus on personalization in insurance. And as mentioned earlier, you will all receive a copy or a link to this recording and an invite to our additional webinars. Thank you.